we'll get that information to you. Okay, we're recording. We'll get that information to you as soon as it's available. So to start, here's just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to see what's required to screen, what options you have available to submit your film in. So we're going to talk about tier 1 and tier 2. And then we're also going to talk about what you have to plan for, what are some things you should consider when preparing your film for submission. So you probably all know, since this is spring semester, unless you weren't here for any reason last semester, SOFA screenings are the end of the semester showcase of films. In the fall, we usually have around 100 films. But in the spring, we also have animation films, finished thesis films, which is like roughly 130 films. So it's a much bigger event in the spring semester. And hopefully this time we'll be all in person again. So we'll get that experience of in-person screenings if you haven't had that experience because of COVID. But it will be super exciting to have everyone be together again in one place. So for screenings, specifically SMPTE, which is another club on campus, we want to promote professional practices, which will prepare you for what it's really like in the industry and how, studios submit their films to movie theaters and how movie theaters actually show these films. There's these standards called the Digital Cinema Initiatives, or DCI, and you will probably see, we talk about this in our documentation about how to make DCPs. These are all SMPTE standards, which stands for the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. And the society essentially makes these standards so that everyone can have, an idea of like what resolution, what frame rate, and everything like that is compatible with some of the hardware that is used to show these films. And then we're also going to talk about digital cinema versus video. So digital cinema is a workflow that is associated with higher quality images. You have a higher encoding of colors. You can encode more colors if you use these standards. You can have higher resolutions, whereas for video is mostly where people just make MP4s or just have just one file, and these are like something you'd upload to YouTube, for example, which is not like the best quality. You're not really concerned about encoding all your colors properly or anything like that. You just want to have an image. So for screenings, we really want to prepare you for the digital cinema world, which is what the industry is like, versus just, outputting a video file for YouTube or just for like streaming or anything like that. So we want to make sure that you're aware of this. So as you all probably know, there's this workflow or process when you go work on your film for submission. You go through pre-production and you think about what format you want to capture your story in and what format would suit your story. In production, you actually go and create your film and choose this format that you wanted to. And then in post-production, this is really where our documentation will come in, where you have to make sure that your picture and your sound are formatted correctly, specifically for screenings. And this will differ whether you choose to do tier 1 or tier 2. And we'll talk about those differences later on. And then finally, you definitely want to quality check, which is QC. That's what QC stands for. Quality check your film before you submit, and then make any changes as necessary. And then we can go over the submission process as well in this meeting, and probably more in depth in our next workshop, which will be closer to screening. So you'll probably have more questions to ask then. So first of all, there's two main things you must consider when choosing whether you want to go for tier 1 or tier 2 submissions. There's your picture format, which includes your resolution and your aspect ratio. And there's also the frame rate, which is the number of frames per second. And then the second thing is your sound format, which determines the number of channels. So usually most people do stereo, which is a 2-channel, but we have the Sound Studio and Magic, and we have a lot of like great sound mixers. So if you want to be bold and go towards surround sound, that would require a tier 2 submission, and it's something that you'd have to keep in mind if you want to go for surround sound. So I've been talking about these 2 tiers, but here are their definitions and how they are different from one another. So I'll start with tier 1, which again is more of the video workflow, as I've talked before, something that you'd be fine submitting to like YouTube or something like that. For a picture format, we want you to do HD, so that'd be 1920 by 1080, 16:9 aspect ratio. Your frame rate, there is no set standard on this, so you can choose either 23.98, 24, 29.97, or 30. These are just some of the common frame rates that you choose. For sound, if you're doing tier 1, you can only do stereo sound. So that'd be 2 channels. There's no support for surround sound. If you want to do surround sound, again, you will have to do a tier 2. And then for submission, you just submit an MP4 file, as I mentioned before, and that's all you have to submit. For tier 2, however, you have 4 options, and these are the DCI formats. So you can do a 2K or a 4K, or and you can do a flat or a scope, and we'll talk about what those mean later. Flat and scope is the aspect ratio. So flat is a little bit close to 1920 by 1080, just a little bit wider. And then scope is like super wide. And we'll get into those specific numbers as we go on. But you do have more options than just like an HD 1920 by 1080 video. Another important thing to note is that if you recorded your film in 1920 by 1080, but you want to do surround sound, and as I mentioned before, surround sound, you must do tier 2, you can always fit your 1920 by 1080 film into a 2K or 4K container. So what that means, you'd pillar box your film into this bigger container, and then you can export that and have that still meet the specifications. So you can definitely do surround sound if you still shot in HD. We would just need to make sure that in post-production, in your like editing software, anything you use, just pillar box your video into one of the specific DCI resolutions so that it meets those standards. And then for submission, if you're doing tier 2, you'd submit what is called a digital cinema package, a DCP, and then we'd directly play that on the Wegmans Theater when screen exists. And you must also submit a video file version of that same film. So, and this video file is simply for archival purposes. This is the file that we must upload to SofaTube so that all the films that are shown at screenings are uploaded to SofaTube just to have the archive there. But we can't upload DCPs to SofaTube. So we must ask you to make just an MP4 file of the exact same film, just so we can have that for putting it up on SofaTube. All right. If you're a little bit confused on if you want to do tier 1 or tier 2, these are just recommendations based on like what class you're in, or like what if you're a first year or a fourth year. So for first year, if you're a first year and you're in a production 1 or 2 class, we really recommend doing tier 1, as it's just a simpler workflow and it's easier to understand. If you want to do tier 2, go ahead. No one is stopping you. These are just recommendations. But to just familiarize yourself with the general screenings process and everything, tier 1 is definitely an easier workflow to work with. If you're doing a workshop film, it's really up to you if you want to go tier 1 or tier 2. Just keep in mind, again, if you want to go for surround sound, that you will have to do tier 2. If you're working on a thesis or you're a grad working on your film, we would recommend you to do tier 2 simply because it's just a higher quality, and it's really preparing you for what's in the industry today. And again, as I mentioned before, just repeating myself, that if you want to do surround sound, either 5.1 or 7.1, we ask you to do tier 2 only. Okay. So now we're going to talk about specifically what picture formats are available to you. So for tier 1, it's HD, so it's a 16:9 aspect ratio. We really do ask you to do 1920 by 1080 and not 720p, just because at this point we're all pretty much known to, if you're probably shooting in 1920 by 1080 at least. 720p is just not that great of a quality, and if you want to showcase your film in the Wegmans Theater, it would just benefit you to just shoot in HD. And then there's no set standard on the frame rate, so you can choose really any frame rate from 23.98 to 24 or 30 frames per second. You get to choose that. For tier 2, this is one of the options. It's called the flat. And as you can see, it's just a little bit wider than the HD. So it's 1998 by 1080. And you can either do 2K or the 4K. And then this, again, for DCI standards, we do require the 24 frames per second. So when you export your film out of whatever software you're working with, just make sure that it's 24 frames per second if you're doing tier 2. Another option if you're doing tier 2 is the scope aspect ratio. And as you can see, it's like much wider than any of the other two. Again, you can do either 2K or 4K resolution. And this, when you show the theater, the curtains on the theater actually open, so you get a much wider area to show your film in. So it just really depends what kind of experience you want your audience to have. A scope film is, I would say, very immersive in the sense that it covers a wider range of the screen. Like the screen actually becomes bigger, so it's really immersive for the audience compared to either the flat or just the HD aspect ratio. But it's really up to you what kind of experience you want your film to be shown in. And this is just putting it all together of what I've been talking about. Again, if you want to create more of a space with your film, you can use the scope, or just if you want to do a tier 2 film but have been shot in HD, it might be easier for you to do the flat, just because it's a much similar aspect ratio to HD than it is to scope. But it's all up to you. If you really want to use another format that I haven't mentioned, for example, a 4:3 aspect ratio, and it is essential to your story and you really want to use this, you can still use this. Just make sure that when you do export your film, it still uses the formats I talked about before. So for example, you have a 4:3 film and you can export that in a 2K flat container, I would call it, or a timeline. And then export that as a 2K flat, and you still will meet the formats required to screen. For sound, again, for tier 1, you can only do stereo, so it's a 2-channel mix. And for tier 2, you can still do only stereo, but it also opens your options to 5.1 surround or 7.1 surround. One last thing is captioning. Captions are required for all films, regardless if they're tier 1 or tier 2. There we have some captioning tutorials on our website, the FVASA website, and we also have some tutorials on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't captioned before, be sure to check those out. Currently, we ask you to have open captions, which are like burned into the picture. Wegmans Theater doesn't currently support a workflow for closed captions. We are looking into that, but as for now, we would require you to do open captions, which are just burned into the image. So is there any questions on that before I jump into more specific tier 2 things, which I feel like a little bit more tricky to understand in tier 1. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm being thorough in covering it. Okay, I will jump ahead and talk about tier 2 in a little more detail. And remember, I will also be covering this in our next workshop where it will be closer to screenings time. So you'll probably have more questions. For tier 2, again, you will need to create a digital cinema package or a DCP. And what this DCP has is the ingredients essentially to create a DCP are called the DCM files. And these are the digital source master files. You'll probably see these acronyms in our documentation, which is why I'm going over them, so you're not confused when I talk about what these things are, but I will get to those. So we're going to talk about how do you create the DCM files? How do you create your DCP and your trim video? That trim video is the MP4 file that you will just upload to SofaTube just for archival purposes. And then you will also need to QC in the Wegmans Theater. You can set up a time to QC as we get closer to screenings. And then just like everyone else, you'll sign up for a screenings time. Okay, so how do you go about creating the DCP, which is what a lot of people probably have more questions on. So creating the DCP is a 2-step process. We ask you to package your DCP with this program called DCPOMatic. It's on all the lab machines, so it's already there. If you're working like in any lab, it should be already on there. And the DCP is not a single file, it is rather a collection of files or a folder that contains kind of like the ingredients for the projector to read everything. The digital source master files is what you need to make your DCP. So you will need one DCM for your picture and one DCM for your sound. So your DCM is basically just like the end, like after you do all your post work, this is just the end final file that you want to show. And you will need that for your picture and then one for your sound. And that is what you will upload to DCPOMatic, and then DCPOMatic will package those files into a DCP for you. So as you can see in this like little workflow thing, you put your picture DSM, you put your audio DSM into DCPOMatic, and DCPOMatic just does all the work for you and just packages it into a DCP. And as I mentioned before, this is just reiterating what I've said before. You combine and package in DCPOMatic. There is documentation, step-by-step documentation on how to do this on our website. And there's also templates already on the lab machines for any of the tier 2 formats that you choose. So you don't even have to go in all the settings and stuff. There's actually just presets on DCPOMatic that you can select based on like what resolution and aspect ratio you chose. And then that just sets everything for you. And then when completed, if you're working on the lab machines, the DCP will be sent to our server automatically. And you also just want to keep a copy for yourself just in case something goes wrong. It's always good to just have a backup copy. So these are just some of the tentative dates for screenings as of now. None of these are official yet, but we will let you know when they are official or if anything has changed. So the SofaTube portal will open April 11th. which is 2 weeks before the general submission deadline. And that general submission deadline is going to be April 25th at 10 p.m. Signups for your screenings time will be April 25th from 7 to 10 in person. And then the first day of screenings is assumed to be the April 28th. And we assume roughly we'll have 4 days of screening. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the 28th through the 1st. It will really depend on the number of films we get. So we might have more or less days, but usually 4 days of screening is about enough to cover everything. But again, it's kind of, we're transitioning back to in-person screenings from COVID times and virtual screenings. So this might change. And that is all I have for now. Are there any questions on anything I've talked about? Well, if you have any questions that come up, you can always email us. Our email is fvasa@rit.edu. And then you can check out our website as well, which has all the documentation. So everything I've talked about and more is all just listed on our website. You can check out our YouTube channel, which has tutorials on captioning, tutorials on how to make a DCP. This will probably get uploaded there as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or just talk to any of us. We're here to help you.